By dusk, both canoes had been found. The boys who were supposed to be in them had not. 20 years later, a brass compass turned up jammed deep between shoreline rocks near an abandoned landing, and the note hidden inside it pointed straight at the man the town had trusted to help find them. In the summer of 2004, 13-year-old Ben Holloway and 13-year-old Lucas Reed were two of the most dependable boys in Troop 214. They were the kind of kids adults always describe the same way: steady, polite, easy to count on. Ben was quiet, thoughtful, the one who checked the map twice and kept his gear packed so neatly it looked like someone had folded it with a ruler. Lucas was warmer, louder, quicker to laugh. He talked to everybody. He was the one who could calm down a nervous younger scout in 10 seconds flat, usually with a joke that was just dumb enough to work. They had been friends for 3 years, ever since a rainy campout where their tent collapsed in the middle of the night. And they spent 4 hours holding the center pole upright and laughing so hard the scoutmaster threatened to split them up next trip. Their parents loved that they balanced each other out. Ben made Lucas slow down. Lucas made Ben loosen up. On the water, they worked especially well together. Ben had rhythm, Lucas had power. Put them in the same canoe, and it moved like it knew where it was going. The canoe trip was supposed to be the highlight of that summer. It was a 2-day route through the Redstone chain, a long string of narrow lakes and quiet channels in northern Wisconsin, with one rough portage around an abandoned quarry inlet and a campsite on a pine ridge at the far end. The trip was a tradition for older scouts earning their canoeing and wilderness survival badges. Parents dropped the boys at base camp with coolers, sunscreen, disposable cameras, and all the usual warnings. Stay with the group, listen to the adults, don't horse around at the landing. It was ordinary. That was part of what made it hurt so much afterward. Nothing about that morning looked like the beginning of a case people would still be talking about 20 years later. Ben brought a brass compass that had belonged to his grandfather. It was heavier than the plastic ones the troop usually issued, and he treated it like something sacred. The top flipped open on a tiny hinge. His grandfather had engraved his initials into the back decades earlier, and Ben's father had later added a second line beneath them: B.H. Troop 214. Ben kept it in the chest pocket of his life vest, clipped to a green cord so he wouldn't lose it if he went into the water. Lucas teased him about it, called it the pirate compass, but he also trusted it. If Ben said the campsite was another quarter of a mile east, Lucas paddled east. The trip leader was Paul Hanley, a middle school science teacher who had run the route before. Calm voice, sunburned nose, strict about life jackets. The road support volunteer that weekend was Dan Kessler, 38, local, practical, and well known to most of the parents. Dan had grown up on Redstone Lake. His family owned part of Kessler Point, a long stretch of rocky shoreline that included an abandoned stone pump house from the quarry days and an old gravel landing no one used anymore. He had helped the troop with fundraisers, hauled gear for winter campouts, and fixed trailer lights in the school parking lot without being asked. He was the kind of adult people described as solid. He was also in the middle of a bitter fight no one in the troop knew much about. Dan's older sister, Anna Kessler, had come back to town that July after years in Duluth. Their mother had died the year before, and buried inside probate papers was a problem Dan had not expected. A shoreline parcel at Kessler Point, the one with the old access road and pump house, had been left to Anna, not him. It mattered more than it sounded. A developer had been sniffing around the lake for months, and the only practical boat access through that stretch of land ran over the parcel Anna now owned. Dan had already been borrowing against a future sale he had no right to promise. He was behind on taxes. His marina repair business was slipping. He needed control of that land, and Anna had made it clear she was not signing anything until she had her own lawyer go through every page. There were signs of that pressure if you looked close enough. A neighbor remembered hearing the siblings arguing outside their late mother's house. A waitress at the dockside remembered Anna crying in the restroom after a lunch meeting with Dan. A clerk at the county recorder's office later said Dan had shown up twice, asking how long it took to file a quitclaim deed. But at the time, none of that meant anything to anyone except the people inside it. On the first day of the trip, the weather held until late afternoon. The troop paddled well. They crossed the first 2 lakes without trouble, stopped for sandwiches on a shale shore, and reached the Narrows by 4. That was where things started to tighten. A stiff wind came down from the west, not dangerous but enough to make the lighter canoes yaw. Paul decided to split the load and send the stronger paddlers slightly ahead to the portage landing so they could start unloading before the weather changed. Ben and Lucas were put in the lead canoe with 2 dry bags, the map tube, and the small food crate. Paul told them to hug the north bank and wait at the landing. Dan, driving around by road, was supposed to meet the troop there with the extra water jugs and the camp stove. Ben and Lucas reached the landing first. That much everyone agreed on. A younger scout in the second canoe saw them swing toward shore. Paul, paddling behind the others, saw their stern vanish around the last point of black rock. The landing itself sat in a narrow cove where the main water bent away from the old quarry inlet. The legal map still marked the crumbling pump house uphill through the trees, but from the water you mostly saw jack pine, broken stone, and a wedge of rusted riprap laid down years earlier to stop erosion. It was quiet there. Too quiet, one of the scouts later said. The water flattened out and even the wind seemed to drop. What happened in the next 20 minutes was reconstructed years later from records, witness statements, physical evidence, and the note inside Ben's compass. For a long time, no one could line it up cleanly. Dan Kessler had not driven directly to the portage landing as planned. Instead, he had turned off onto the old quarry access road and parked near the abandoned pump house, where Anna had agreed to meet him one last time. She came in her own car. Her brother had told her he was ready to stop fighting and wanted to go over the boundary survey together before involving attorneys. He brought coffee, he brought papers. He also brought a forged deed with a signature line already flagged. Anna refused to sign. According to the prosecutor's theory, later backed by the evidence, the argument moved outside, down toward the stone steps behind the pump house. There, Dan stopped asking and started threatening. He told her he would lose everything without that parcel. She told him he had already lied to too many people, and she was done covering for him. At some point she turned to leave. He grabbed her. She fell hard against a low iron winch mount left from the quarry years. The blow split the back of her head. Whether Dan meant to kill her or not no longer mattered after that. She was dead within minutes, and then he heard paddles knocking softly against aluminum. Ben and Lucas had beached their canoe below the rocks and climbed high enough to see through the pines. They did not understand the whole scene, but they understood enough. They saw Dan. They saw Anna on the ground. One of them, probably Lucas, shouted his name. That moment changed all 3 of their lives. Dan came down the path fast but not frantic. That part was important. Panic would have sent the boys running. Calm kept them in place. He told them Anna had slipped, told them he needed help, told them Paul was still back on the water and every second mattered. The boys knew him. Ben had been in Dan's garage 2 months earlier helping sand a canoe rack for a fundraiser. Lucas had eaten hot dogs at Dan's picnic table after spring cleanup day. Trust was already there. That was the opening he used. Later, investigators believed the boys followed him up the path at least partway before they realized something was wrong. There were tiny signs of hesitation built into what Ben left behind. His compass was not found on the path or near the pump house. It was found back at the landing, wedged hard into a seam between 2 shoreline rocks, as if someone had shoved it deep with purpose. The best explanation was simple and heartbreaking. At some point between the canoe and the path, Ben understood this was not an accident, slipped back a step under the excuse of checking the gear, opened the compass, and hid the only message he thought might survive. But nobody knew that yet. When Paul Hanley and the rest of the troop reached the landing, the lead canoe was there. So was the food crate. The boys were not. At first it did not look like a crime scene. It looked messy. One paddle was on shore, one was still inside the canoe. Ben's cap was in the water weeds. Their footprints were mixed together in damp gravel, crossed over by older tire tracks that nobody treated as urgent because Dan was supposed to be there by truck anyway. Paul assumed the boys had either stepped up the trail to look for Dan or drifted out again by mistake. He yelled their names. So did the other scouts. The woods answered with nothing. Then Dan showed up from the roadside. He was breathing hard. He asked where Ben and Lucas were. Paul said he thought they were with Dan. Dan said no, he had just gotten there and hadn't seen them. It sounds almost absurd in hindsight. How quickly one sentence can bend the direction of an entire investigation. But that was the moment it bent. If Dan had said the boys had run up the path, if Paul had gone uphill first, if one deputy had sealed the landing before dark, the whole case might have ended in a week. Instead, the wind rose, the lights started to go, and somebody found the second paddle floating 30 yards off the point. From there, the theory that took over was the one people could understand. Two boys got to the landing first. They stepped back into the canoe, or tried to pull it around the rocks, or fooled around near the water's edge. A gust caught them. The current pushed them out toward the quarry cut, where submerged stone shelves and sharp wind chop made recovery difficult. It was not a perfect theory, but it was close enough to something familiar that it gained weight fast. The first search was huge. Deputies, volunteer firefighters, conservation wardens, divers, boats dragging sonar, a helicopter from the county, families on shore. Redstone Lake was combed from one end to the other. The narrows were dragged. The inlet was checked with poles. Searchers walked the banks and called into brush so thick it swallowed sound. What they did not do, not really, was treat the upland area around the old pump house like the center of the event. They looked there, but briefly, and already under the assumption that two wet boys might have wandered uphill for help. When they found no obvious sign of them, they went back to the water. There were reasons for that. The weather turned ugly after dark. Volunteers trampled the landing before anyone cast it properly. Dan told the deputies the old quarry road above the inlet had washed out weeks earlier and was barely passable, which made it less likely the boys had gone that way alone. Paul Hanley, crushed and exhausted, kept circling back to the same terrible thought. He had sent them ahead. Search leaders knew time mattered in a likely drowning, and every hour spent on land felt like an hour stolen from the water. By the second morning, the working assumption had hardened. Still, there were details that didn't sit right. Ben's father asked why there were no skid marks from a canoe scramble if the boys had slipped back in at the landing. Lucas's mother wanted to know how both boys could vanish without a out when the rest of the troop was only minutes behind. One of the younger scouts remembered hearing a truck door slam from uphill before they rounded the point, but by the time he said it, adults were already sorting rumor from memory and let it go. A deputy noted that the canoe had been tied too neatly to a scrub pine to suggest panic, then later softened the language in the report to possibly secured prior to accidental re-entry. Small things, each one thin on its own, together enough to keep the families awake for years. What no one outside Dan knew was what happened after he led the boys away from the water. The prosecutor would later argue that Dan walked Ben and Lucas up to the pump house by keeping the emergency alive. Anna had fallen. He needed them to help carry gear. He needed them to stay quiet and move fast. Once inside the stone building, with the heavy metal door between them and the shoreline, the story changed. One of the boys saw Anna's body. One tried to run. There was evidence of impact damage on an old lower wall and a broken latch in the cellar below. The state's forensic anthropologist believed Lucas was struck first, likely with a short iron bar kept near the winch assembly. Ben was restrained with nylon line, then killed minutes later when he would not stop shouting. It was brutal, clumsy, and fast. Not the work of some criminal mastermind. The work of an ordinary man deciding, one awful decision at a time, that each lie now required a worse one after it. The concealment was as practical as the rest of it. Beneath the pump house floor sat a decommissioned settling tank from the quarry days, a concrete chamber almost 12 feet deep, dry for decades and forgotten by everyone except the families who had owned the land. Dan knew it was there because he had played in the building as a kid. He lowered all three bodies into the chamber, covered them with broken stone and old lime dust from stacked quarry bags, then laid scrap steel over the opening. During the following week, while the whole town searched the lake, he came back twice at night with fill from his marina yard and a portable mixer. By the time anyone ever looked seriously at the building again, the chamber was buried under a fresh concrete patch, hidden beneath years of dirt and oil staining. Before leaving the shoreline that first evening, he staged the disappearance. He pushed the boys' canoe back out, let it drift into open chop, then later guided it farther along the rocks with a pole, so it would be found loose and battered. He tossed a paddle. He kept one life vest clip that later turned up in his truck, though nobody knew what it was then. And while he did all that, Ben's compass stayed hidden where the boy had forced it, deep into the seam of the riprap beside the landing. The first week after the boys disappeared broke the town open. Flyers on gas station windows, prayer circles at the school gym, parents taking turns sitting by the phone even after the search shifted from rescue to recovery. Paul Hanley stopped leading trips. Lucas's little sister refused to sleep unless the hallway light stayed on. Ben's father went back to the landing almost every weekend that fall and stood there with binoculars like the water, might eventually give up and be decent enough to return what it took. Dan Kessler was there through all of it. That was another thing that worked in his favor. He carried cases of bottled water to volunteers. He helped drag brush. He drove elderly relatives from the parking area to the shore when the hill got too steep. Grief and usefulness can look a lot like innocence when people want badly enough to believe the right person is helping. The official investigation slowed by winter. No bodies, no confirmed blood. No witness who could say they saw Ben and Lucas with anyone after the canoe reached shore. The sheriff's office kept the file open, but the working classification drifted from missing under suspicious circumstances back toward presumed drowned pending recovery. Families hated that phrase. Presumed drowned. It sounded administrative, clean, like a form could do the work of certainty. The one name that barely registered at the time was Anna Kessler's. She had been reported missing 4 days after the boys vanished by a friend in Duluth who said Anna had stopped answering calls and never showed for a shift she was supposed to pick up the following week. Dan told police they had argued about property. Yes, but she left town in her own car and always had a talent for disappearing when life got messy. Anna had broken plans before. She had once spent 2 weeks in Colorado without telling anyone but a roommate. Her car was later found at a bus depot 30 miles south, parked legally with no obvious sign of violence. That should have made investigators more suspicious. Instead, it helped Dan. It gave Anna a story that fit an old version of herself, and because her disappearance was handled by another agency, and the boys' case was eating resources, the overlap never got the full attention it deserved. Years passed, and the case settled into that terrible space cold cases settle into, where everything important has happened but none of it is resolved. Paul Hanley moved away. The younger scouts grew up. Some of them still said they could picture the exact angle of the empty canoe against the reeds. Ben's mother kept his room almost unchanged until they sold the house. Lucas's mother did not. She packed everything 6 months after the vigil and put the boxes in the attic because, as she later said, pretending a child is coming back is a different kind of torture from admitting you don't know. Every few years the case flared again. A dive team offered new sonar. A retired detective said he believed the boys had been abducted. A podcast picked it up and treated the story like a riddle. But nothing stuck because nothing concrete ever moved. The water theory still had enough weight to block everything else, and Dan Kessler kept growing older inside a life that looked almost insultingly normal. He sold the marina. He sat on the Volunteer Lake Association board. He remarried briefly, then divorced quietly. If anyone thought it was strange that he refused every interview request about the old case after the 10th anniversary, they kept it to themselves. What never fully disappeared was one detail from the original file. The boys' landing area had been documented poorly. The photographs were bad. The shoreline had changed over time due to ice heave and storm damage, and the old riprap wall near the landing, the place no one cared about because it was just rocks holding back erosion, had never been dismantled or searched by hand. In the spring of 2024, a hard thaw followed by 3 days of rain chewed a section of bank away near Kessler Point. The county sent a road crew to inspect washout along the old service route above the landing. One of the workers climbed down to check which rocks had shifted and saw a dull brass edge flashing from deep in a crack where 2 big stones had separated. At first, he thought it was part of an old boat fitting. He pried it loose with a screwdriver and found a compass, heavy and corroded, still attached to a rotten green cord. Because Redstone is the kind of town where certain stories never really leave, the worker knew exactly what he might be holding. He turned it over, saw the faint engraving on the back through the green oxidation, and called it in before he even walked back up the slope. 20 years had passed almost to the week. The detective who caught the reopened case was Mara Sullivan from the State Cold Case Unit. She was 39, methodical, not dramatic, and young enough that she had been in high school when Ben and Lucas disappeared. She remembered the yellow ribbons on mailboxes. She also remembered the way adults used to lower their voices whenever the story came up, as if the boys might still somehow hear them. Mara's strength was that she did not walk into old cases to defend the original theory. She walked into them looking for the first place everyone got lazy. At the lab, technicians cleaned the compass in stages. The engraving became clearer, GH, then beneath it BH Troop 214. The hinge was stiff but intact. When they eased the backplate apart, something rattled inside. Not a mechanism, paper. It was a tiny strip, waxed from an old map edge, rolled so tight it looked like a dead insect at first. Protected inside the brass case, it had not dissolved. When conservation unfolded it under magnification, the pencil writing was still there, cramped, uneven. Rushed, Dan took us to Old Stone House. There was one more mark after that, possibly the start of another word, but it ended in a hard drag line as if the writer had been interrupted. That note changed the case in one afternoon. Until then, suspicion had always floated in a general way, an abduction, a trusted adult, a local. But Ben had named one. Not by last name, not with courtroom precision, but enough. There was only one Dan connected to the troop in that landing. There was only one old stone house on the relevant maps. Suddenly, the lake stopped being the center of the story. Kessler Point became the center. Mara reopened every file tied to the property. Survey records, probate disputes, utility maps. Environmental assessments from the old quarry. She found Anna Kessler's name fast, then found the deed conflict that had barely been touched in the original investigation. She learned that Dan had filed a quitclaim transfer less than 3 weeks after Anna disappeared, using a signature now believed to be forged. She found delivery receipts for crushed fill and cement billed to Dan's business the week after Ben and Lucas vanished, supposedly for shoreline repair at the marina. She found a handwritten note in an old bank file showing the developer interest in Kessler Point had been contingent on road access through Anna's parcel. Motive came into focus slowly, then all at once. Dan was cornered in the summer of 2004. He needed the shoreline parcel to save his finances. Anna had the legal right to block him. She disappeared the same day the boys did. The boys left a note naming Dan in the old stone house. It was enough for a warrant. The pump house looked smaller than people remembered. That happens with places carried in rumor for too long. It sat crooked among birch saplings. One wall split by roots, roof half gone, smelling of dust and cold stone. But beneath the grime, investigators found what Mara had hoped for. A concrete patch across part of the floor that was visibly newer than the original foundation, though weathered now into the same gray family of time. Ground-penetrating radar showed a void below. The excavation took 2 days. Families waited in town because no one wanted them standing there through the digging. When the slab was opened, workers found scrap steel first, then fill, then the chamber. The remains of 3 people were inside. The identification took months, but the basics were clear immediately. 2 adolescent males, 1 adult female, buttons from an old Scout BSA shirt. A belt buckle Ben's father recognized before he had to be told not to say it out loud. A silver ring from Anna Kessler's right hand with a chipped turquoise stone visible in photographs from her 20s. The chamber had done exactly what Dan intended, held the bodies out of water, out of sight, and out of the search pattern until time itself finally moved the wrong rock. Dan Kessler was arrested at his house on a Tuesday morning. He was 58. Neighbors later said he looked more annoyed than shocked, like somebody had come to discuss a property line he was tired of hearing about. During questioning, he denied everything. Said he had not seen the boys alone. Said Anna left town angry. Said the note could have been fabricated. Said plenty of old stone houses existed in northern Wisconsin. But the case against him kept stacking. A retired clerk from the recorder's office identified Dan as the man who had pressed for the deed filing after Anna vanished. A former gravel supplier found a ledger copy showing Dan had paid cash for fill on a Sunday evening, something he had remembered only because he hated Sunday pickups. A mechanic testified that Dan had brought in his truck a week after the disappearances asking for the bed liner to be replaced because battery acid had spilled on it. Trace testing on a preserved fragment from the original liner, kept in a shop burn barrel sample purely by chance during an unrelated environmental cleanup, revealed old blood proteins too degraded for a named DNA hit but consistent with biological transfer. More important was the physical layout of the crime. Prosecutors showed how Dan could park at the quarry road, meet Anna unseen from the main lake, and still make it to the troop landing within minutes. They showed that the original washed-out road claim was false. An old county photo taken 2 days after the disappearance, buried in highway records, clearly showed the road passable to the pump house. Then came the note. Ben's note became the spine of the whole trial. Defense lawyers attacked it from every direction. They said the paper could not be authenticated to a specific hour. They said Dan was common. They said the case had become a small town's need for closure dressed up as certainty. But the state had more than grief by then. They had Ben naming Dan. They had the stone house. They had Anna's body in the same chamber as the boys. They had a financial reason, a geographic match, a concealment method only someone familiar with the property would know, and a forged deed filed right after all 3 victims vanished. The hardest part to hear, according to people who sat through the trial, was the full reconstruction of Ben and Lucas's last hour. Prosecutors argued that after Anna died, Dan used familiarity and urgency to pull the boys off the shoreline. Lucas realized first that something was wrong and tried to back away. Ben, who had always been the careful one, used the seconds he had to write the note, fold it tight, tuck it inside the compass, and jam the compass into the rocks at the landing as a marker and message. He must have hoped somebody would search properly. Maybe the next hour, maybe the next day. He could not have known he was leaving it for men with shovels 20 years later. When the medical examiner testified, she was careful. Time had taken too much for exact causes on every point, but not enough to erase the broad truth. Anna died from blunt force trauma to the back of the head. Lucas had injuries consistent with a forceful strike and peri-mortem rib damage. Ben showed evidence of restraint. That told the jury what the defense could not soften. This was not one accident followed by panic. It was a sequence. A choice, then another choice, then another. Dan did not testify. The jury convicted him on 3 counts of first-degree intentional homicide, plus forgery and concealment charges tied to Anna's property records. By the time the verdict was read, Ben's mother was holding Luca's mother's hand so tightly both women had red marks on their fingers. People always imagine courtroom endings as loud. Most of the time they are quiet. The truth lands, and then people sit there trying to understand what exactly it changes and what it never can. What it changed for the families was not the loss. That stayed. It changed the shape of the loss. For 20 years they had lived inside not knowing, and not knowing is its own kind of punishment because the mind keeps manufacturing endings. Drowning, hypothermia, a crash in the dark, one boy surviving longer than the other. None of it good, all of it endless. The case finally gave them a boundary around the horror. A man did this. Here is why. Here is where. Here is how he hid them. Here is how he got away with it for so long. It also forced the town to sit with something uglier than a mystery. The boys were not taken by wilderness or bad luck. They were taken by the kind of man communities are built to excuse. Useful, familiar, local, helpful in a crisis. The same trust that made Dan dangerous also made him invisible once suspicion should have fallen on him. People had not just failed to catch him. In small ways, without meaning to, they had helped hold the door open. After the trial, the old landing at Kessler Point was cleared and fenced. The pump house was demolished under court order. The families asked that the chamber not be preserved. They did not want a ruin turning into a roadside curiosity for strangers with cameras. Ben's compass, after the case was over, was returned to his parents. They donated copies of the note to the archive and kept the original with the compass in a shadow box they do not display publicly. Lucas's family asked for one of his recovered uniform buttons and had it set into a small frame beside his school portrait. Paul Hanley came back for the sentencing. He had carried that day like a stone in his chest for 2 decades. And even after the conviction, he told a reporter there were some things he would never forgive in himself. Sending the boys ahead was one of them. Mara Sullivan said something more useful later. She said guilt is not always proof of responsibility. Sometimes it is just what decent people carry when indecent people use their trust against them. In the end, the compass did exactly what Ben needed it to do. It outlasted the water theory. It outlasted the bad photographs, the weather, the fading memories, the polite lies. and the years Dan Kessler spent living as if time itself might save him. A 13-year-old boy, standing on a rough patch of shoreline with danger close enough to feel, managed to leave the one honest record of what was happening. He hid it in brass, forced it into stone, and waited longer than anyone should have to wait. That is the part people remember now when they talk about Redstone Lake. Not just the loss, though that never leaves, not even the trial. They remember that two boys set out on a canoe trip in the middle of an ordinary summer and ran straight into an adult's private violence. They remember how easily routine can cover something terrible. And they remember that the case was solved because one of those boys, in the worst minutes of his life, still thought clearly enough to leave the truth where, eventually, somehow it could be found.